just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. I'm continuing my Sopranos rewatch today with Season 1, Episode 5, College, which originally aired on February 7th, 1999. This episode was written by James Manos Jr. and series creator David Chase. Jason Cahill, who wrote the prior episode Meadowlands, returned to work on this episode as executive story editor. College is the 5th episode, but it's also an episode of firsts. It's the first episode of The Sopranos to take place outside of New Jersey, or outside of the tri-state area anyway. It's the first episode directed by Alan Coulter, who will go on to direct 12 total episodes of The Sopranos, and it's the first episode to show Tony committing murder. Not only that, but this is considered a landmark episode for both The Sopranos and television in general. And why is that? Let's find out. Characters. Tony Ray Rossi guest stars as Fabian Febby Petrulio, aka Fred Peters. Most of the crew is conspicuously absent. There's no Junior, no Livia, no Sil, no Paulie, no Big Puss, no Artie or Charmaine, and although Melfi puts in an appearance, there's no therapy session. For existing characters, this is a pretty big episode and it reveals a lot. This episode marks the return of Father Phil Intantola. Just like Irina, the character is in the pilot episode that was filmed in 1997, but a different actor was cast after HBO decided to make the show. In the pilot, he was played by Michael Santoro. Paul Schultz plays him for the remainder of the series. Father Phil appears in 15 total episodes. Now, Father Phil's appearance in the pilot is very brief. He does a little more than scold and lightly whack AJ on the back when AJ curses. Little more is mentioned about him except that Tony is uncomfortable with the priest around his home, presumably due to his criminal lifestyle choices. It's in this episode that he grows into a recurring character. Spending the night at the Sopranos household with only Carmela present begins an awkward dynamic in which Carmen and Father Phil seem to be attracted to each other, but both of their religious ideals and impracticality, given Tony's quickly growing suspicions, prevent them from giving in. Now, Christopher is the only member of the Jersey crew to make an appearance in this episode, other than Tony, of course. From a writing perspective, I often wondered if Christopher was included as a way to do exposition through dialogue, which is a good technique. Otherwise, Tony would have to have a voiceover to reveal his thoughts, which doesn't really fit well with the storytelling style of the show. Having Tony call Chris on the phone gives him an opportunity to communicate what he's thinking, not just to Chris, but to the audience as well, airing his suspicions about the guy he sees at the gas station being a rat that betrayed the Mafia's code of silence years ago. But as usual, the writing on The Sopranos is top-notch, and they use Chris's time in this episode to further his characterization. In the prior episode, Christopher was eager to bounce back and prove himself after being roughed up by 2 Russians working for Junior. Christopher continues to bring that eagerness by telling Tony that he's Tony's soldier and he wants to whack the rat himself. This also ties in with Christopher's early ambition he mentions in 46 Long about wanting to be a made guy. And in this episode, he mentions how whacking a rat would further his career ambitions. I like the enthusiastic energy Michael Imperioli brings to this role, especially in this episode. And then there's Fielder. This episode, appropriately named College, continues Fielder's goal of going to college far away from New Jersey so she can get away from her hypocritical and criminal family. Fielder resents her family for being criminals, yet she took illegal street drugs when she found it necessary in episode 3, something she comes clean about in this episode, while also promising to stay clean and no longer use drugs. This is a big episode for Fielder. She finally asks her father about his life of crime, something she suspected to a point of certainty for a very, very long time. This is an absolutely huge episode for Carmela. One of the first lines of dialogue she has is regarding Fielder. After asking Tony about Bates College, Carm says anything to get Fielder off that Berkeley kick. This is a growing conflict between mother and daughter, going back to the pilot episode when Fielder refuses to go to the plaza with her mother for tea and scones. Fielder mentions she hopes when she grows up she'll live far away from New Jersey. Fielder even tells Hunter that she can't wait for the entire North American landmass to be between her and her family, a primary motivation for her to go to Berkeley. Carmela opposes this and wants Fielder to stay closer to home. Her evolving motives here are open to some interpretation. Carmela probably doesn't want to feel rejected and would like her daughter close to home so she can see her more often, but it's also possible that she wants Fielder close so she can maintain a degree of control over her daughter. When AJ brings Carmela poached egg, she says, "Bonjour, room service est arrivé," which is French for good morning and has arrived. So what she's saying is, good morning, room service has arrived. In French, of course. And I think this is the first time Carmela speaks French on the show. Rosaline and her go to Paris many seasons later, and I think she does speak some French. So I think she learned it in college, if I recall correctly. This episode also fuels her continuing suspicions about Tony's infidelity when Melfi calls and Carmela discovers that Tony's psychiatrist is a woman and not a man, something she assumed in the prior episode and Tony deliberately concealed from her by not correcting her, commonly called a lie by omission. But most important of all, this episode contains the Carmela Confession. It's more obvious now, especially when listening to David Chase's director's commentary of the pilot episode, that Carmela marrying Tony was effectively her choice to make a deal with the devil. However, when the show first aired in '99, things weren't so cut and dry. The scene with Charmaine in episode 3 revealed a lot about Charmaine's critical thoughts about Carmela's choice to marry Tony, but there remained a sliver of doubt that Carmela could be a victim, someone charmed by Tony and fooled into believing that he was an honest-to-goodness regular dude, and that she may have found out the truth about him only after marrying him. In this episode, Carmela reveals that she knew exactly who Tony was before she married him, and that she made a conscious decision to marry into organized crime to reap the financial and material benefits. Carmela is therefore not a victim, but an accessory, or perhaps an enabler, as Dr. Krakauer remarks in Season 3. Yet, as the Buddha once said, the fool eats from the tree of evil, thinking its fruit is sweet, until it ripens in their mouth, and they go about in pity for themselves. But more than anyone else, this episode is a big one for series protagonist Tony Soprano. There's more of Tony's backstory in this episode. Feeler asks him about his semester and a half of college and why he didn't finish. Although Tony has mentioned going to college before, this is the first time it's revealed where he went, which is Seton Hall, a university in South Orange, New Jersey. Which, by the way, according to Google Maps, it's like a 20 to 25-minute drive from the Caldwell neighborhood that the Sopranos house is in. Tony also tells Feeler why he didn't finish college. It wasn't considered important to Tony's own parents. He also admits that he was lucky to just get in, and he didn't have the ability to complete a degree. This furthers Tony's characterization of him blaming his circumstances and saying that he was born into the life he has now. Tony also tells his daughter that he likes history, and this is possibly related to his nostalgia for the good old days or the good times. Now, many fans I've spoken to over the years consider this episode to be self-contained, almost like a mini-movie within the series. In terms of plot, I think this makes sense, and it is true. You could make a somewhat modern noir film based upon what happens in this episode, and could probably watch it without seeing the prior 4 episodes and still make sense of it more or less. One storytelling technique I recall from Professor Dupre's film arts class that I took long ago is the idea of 1, 2, 3 being a common motif. If you know anything about writing, people go on and on about 3-act story structure. Directors even use it within a scene since it's so fused with audience psyches. In fact, I remember Dupre mentioning the opening of Saving Private Ryan where Tom Hanks' character talks to the radioman on the beach. The third time he looks over, he finds that the guy is dead. Getting back to The Sopranos, the prior episodes of Denial, Anger, Acceptance, and Meadowlands form a series that ends with this episode, College. Denial, Anger, Acceptance ends with Melfi asking Tony a question. Does Tony feel like a Frankenstein, an unfeeling monster? And it's a question that brilliantly is not answered by Tony. It's left to the audience to really decide. The following episode, Meadowlands, ends with Tony winking at AJ. That episode asks the opposite question. Is Tony not a monster, but a loving father? These 2 questions from the 2 preceding episodes seem mutually exclusive. How can a criminal sociopath possibly be a kind family man? Ultimately, characters are their choices. The choices that they make when they have to make a decision one way or another. Who is Tony? College is the episode that answers that question. Who is Tony? If a character is their choices, let's examine those. When Tony uses a payphone, he calls his mistress before checking in with his sick wife. And he practically hangs up on her when he spots Fabian the rat. Perhaps he's not a loving husband. He puts his own daughter in danger to chase down Fabian. To me, this is the moment that Tony's 2 worlds collide. He literally and illegally crosses a line into oncoming traffic while figuratively crossing the line between his mobster and father identities. Something else I thought about after rewatching this episode is Feeler admitting to using speed. Tony reflects on how it happened right under his nose, and he didn't have the faintest idea. The first time I saw this in 1999, I was a teenager. And I thought Tony lamenting this reflected mostly on Feeler's ability to hide something as serious as drug use. Now that I'm much older, I think much more about the fact that Tony fooling around with Irina is why he's not at home as often as he probably should be. And I wonder if he was spending more time with his children, he might have noticed the pressure his daughter is under and offer her help or guidance so she wouldn't feel compelled to take drugs. On the other hand, when Fielder asks her father if he's in the mafia, he denies it at first, but eventually admits that he's involved in organized crime. But this honesty is, honestly, short-lived. After Tony kills Fabian, he picks up Fielder and she notices his dirty shoes and the cut on his hand. Tony lies to her and makes up a story about how he lost his watch, stepped in a puddle trying the back door of the restaurant while looking for the watch, and he cut his hand on a screen door. But even worse, Tony crosses the line into gaslighting. If you don't know, gaslighting is a psychological term in which someone manipulates another person by having them question their reality. It's named after a 1944 film called Gaslight, in which a villain has a gas-powered light turn on but insists that it isn't, in fact, on. In fact, if you're a Star Trek fan, Picard experiences a modified version of this as torture in the Next Generation episode, Chain of Command, when his interrogator insists that there are 5 lights and not 4. And Jean-Luc Picard, Patrick Stewart has this really dramatic moment where he's like, there are 4 lights! And it's a pretty good episode, I like that. So where does Tony cross the line between lying and gaslighting? Lying about where he was and what he was doing in Fielder's absence is a lie. As an example, saying that he cut his hand on the screen door, or that his shoes are dirty because he stepped in a puddle. Those are lies because Fielder was not there, and what he's saying is untruthful. But when Fielder mentions Tony was using the payphone in the middle of the night, and he tells her that she was drunk and must have been imagining things, he's gaslighting her by insisting that her ability to perceive reality is the problem instead of addressing what she observed and the logical questions it would lead to. Gaslighting his own daughter is a form of psychological abuse, and he's using it to conceal his criminal behavior. He even starts to act offended at her questioning him at all. Tony's lies have very obvious consequences that he seems to be deliberately ignoring. Fielder at best doubts his lies. In the prior episode, he doesn't tell Carmela that his shrink is a woman, a fact that she confronts him about at the end of this episode. Yet he continues to downplay, if not outright deny, reality. And last but certainly not least, Tony kills Fabian. Although Fabian did come close to killing Tony, Tony did chase him in his car, and I wonder if Tony had just let the guy drive away, if Fabian would have tracked Tony to his motel, or just let it go. So let's review what Tony's motives are for killing Fabian. The obvious answer is that Fabian is a rat, but is there more to it? When Tony tracks Fabian to his house, he finds that the rat is seemingly married to a woman, and like Tony, he also has a daughter. Has Fabian moved on with his life? Is he the happy wanderer type that Tony later admits to Melfi that he resents for their blissful happiness and feels compelled to impulsively ruin? According to Tony, Fabian flipped after being caught peddling H, foreshadowing Big Puss's betrayal, and harkening back to the pilot episode in which Tony laments the loss of old-school values, and how guys these days have no room for the Pinot experience, how many guys no longer honor the code of silence. This is echoed in the cold open of 46 Long, when the guy on television says that the government's long drug-related sentences will be the downfall of the mafia, the end of the good times Tony yearns to return to. Fabian does beg, though, and regardless of Tony's reasons, he does make a very deliberate decision. He chooses to kill. The show must go on, as they say, and it does, and there are additional layers of complexity to explore with Tony as a character. But the conclusion of this episode reminds me of what Melfi's ex-husband says later in the series. Ultimately, everything comes down to good and evil, and Tony is evil. Now it's time to talk about the plot. Though I've never had the makings of a varsity plotter, which is a tremendous blow to my self-esteem. Most Sopranos episodes have multiple plot threads, but for this episode, it's consolidated into 2 or maybe 3 plot lines. There's Carmela and Father Phil, Tony and Fielder. Tony and Fabian could arguably be separated as a 3rd plot line, but I'm going to consolidate them into the Carmela plot line and the Tony plot line. The sacred and the plot. Let's recap these 2 plot lines. Carmela and Father Phil. Carmela's plot begins when Tony calls Carmela, who's sick at home, though he quickly hangs up. AJ makes Carm breakfast, a poached egg, but it's still in its shell, which I'm not sure you're supposed to do with poached eggs, though I haven't made them in a while. Carmela isn't really impressed with AJ's cooking and tells him he can go over to Jason's for an hour. Father Phil stops by, Carm hastily freshens up. Father Phil has a confession to make, he has a Jones for Carmela's baked ziti. Father Phil makes a fire, gives her a book on religion, and there's some Chianti. Word up. Dr. Melfi calls, and Carm realizes that Tony lied by omission about his therapist being a woman. She then immediately assumes he's sleeping with Melfi since he lied. Phil and Carm have ziti while discussing faith and religion. After eating, Father Phil says he should go, but due to the rain outside, she suggests he stays and watch a DVD with her. While watching the remains of the day, Carmela becomes upset and confesses to Father Phil that she married Tony despite knowing that he's an evil criminal. Father Phil then gives her communion. He gulps a bit too much wine. AJ calls, and his be home in an hour at Jason's turns into sleeping over. Carm and Father Phil almost kiss, but he stumbles to the powder room and orally refunds the wine. In the morning, Father Phil wakes up on the couch. Things between him and Carmela are awkward, but she insists that they didn't do anything wrong, though his car has been in the driveway in plain sight all night long. Father Phil admits he's tempted by Carmela, and this was the most difficult test of his faith and commitment to priesthood. Carmela looks at Phil a bit differently, and then he leaves. Tony comes home and notices there's no Ziti. He asks if Monsignor Jughead visited, and Carmela tells him the truth. Father Itan Tola spent the night here, but nothing happened. Tony seems to doubt her, but Carm brings up Melfi's phone call, with the subtext being she knows that Tony was not honest with her earlier, and she walks away from him. The Tony and Fielder plotline begins with bells ringing while Tony waits for Fielder on a college campus. There's some father-daughter banter, and Fielder asks him about his brief time at college. On the road, Fielder asks him, "Are you in the Mafia?" Tony denies it at first, but when Fielder gives him sad puppy eyes, he more or less admits to it. They stop at the gas station where Tony calls Irina at a payphone. Irina is a malcontent who wishes she had a knight in white satin armor. Tony then calls Carmela, who's homesick. In mid-conversation, Tony spots someone and quickly hangs up to follow him. He drives like a madman despite his endangered daughter losing her mind in the passenger seat. He plays it off as just fooling around. When they reach their motel, Tony stops pursuing the guy and simply parks the car. Tony then calls Christopher and tells him he thinks he saw Fabian Petrulio, a maid guy who flipped over 10 years ago for peddling H. One thing I missed when I first saw this episode in '99 is when Tony and Christopher are talking, it's mentioned that Fabian made a bust of Frank Sinatra. And it's mentioned that Fabian makes overly thick lips on the busts that he makes, a plot point that will come up later. Tony and Fielder have dinner at a restaurant. Tony asks her if AJ knows that he's a mobster, and Fielder hints that she thinks he might. As the audience, we know from the prior episode, Meadowlands, that Fielder is the one who told him, but she omits that detail from her father. Fielder also admits to taking drugs, since Tony was honest with her earlier. But this angers Tony considerably, though he does calm down and thanks her for being honest with him. Fielder meets a few Colby students, and Tony suggests she hang out with them. Tony then calls Christopher again, who gives him an address based upon the license plate Tony told him to run earlier. Tony goes to the address and finds Fabian chilled in a hot tub. It's interesting that Fabian and his wife are enjoying a hot tub, considering how Tony asked Irina earlier on the phone if she was enjoying the jacuzzi jet that he bought for her tub. Tony checks around town for Fabian's place of business, while Fabian is attempting to track down Tony. I think it's worth noting here that Fabian's appearance at the restaurant shows that he's tracking Tony effectively, since he's showing up somewhere Tony was earlier. In writing, I think this is a good way to build tension, by showing the protagonist and the antagonist at the same place but at different times. Tony finds Peter's Travel in the dictionary and drives to the address, where he finds a trailer and sees a bust of President Reagan with the thick lips mentioned earlier, which is why Tony knows he's found who he's looking for. At the same time, Fabian sees Sopranos' name on the Denoki Motel guest list. Now, at the Denoki Motel, Tony returns with a drunk Fielder. Fabian is waiting to ambush Tony, but hesitates and misses his chance. Now, it is really interesting that Fabian is aiming at Tony's right side as he's walking with Fielder, at a 3 o'clock position, something that figures into Sopranos lore later in the series. Now, Carmela calls Tony in the middle of the night and says nothing. Carm's reasons for calling are not expressly stated, but I always wondered if, despite Tony being several states away, Carmela wanted to make sure Tony was not even remotely close to home as Father Phil and her continued to drink a little too much wine. But Tony probably thinks it's the rat calling, to confirm that he's there, to set up some kind of an ambush. It's sometimes a sign of really good writing when what characters and the audience know is considerably different, since you can observe the character's reaction to how they interpret events that aren't actually happening within the fictional world they inhabit. So I really like this moment. In the morning, Tony drops Fielder off at college and lies about losing his watch so he can ditch her and hunt down Fabian. Fielder doesn't seem to entirely believe his excuse, but oh well. Fabian meets with some druggies and tries to coerce them into murdering Tony, but they seem disinclined to acquiesce. Fabian then hears something and goes to check it out. Note that there's a duck wind thingy by Fabian's trailer. I thought that's an interesting detail because of ducks. Now Fabian does spot a deer and thinks that that's actually what made the noise that he heard earlier, but it's not. It's Tony who's there to kill him. Tony then sees ducks flying away after he kills Fabian, which is a rut-row moment for Tony. Tony then goes to pick up Fielder at Colby. He tells her an elaborate story about searching for and finding his watch, but she doesn't believe him, probably because he's lying. At Bowdoin College, Tony looks up at a quote on the wall by Hawthorne. No man, for any considerable period, can wear one face to himself and another to the multitude, without finally getting bewildered as to which may be true. Highly allegorical, the sacred and the profane. Now, one thought I had during this rewatch was how Christopher appears in this episode, mostly for the sake of exposition. So Tony can have dialogue that explains what he's doing. If you cut Christopher out entirely and Tony was just following some random guy, killing him would be quite a twist. But having Christopher allows for the tension to build up because you know Tony wants to kill this guy, have him whacked. For a television episode, tension works better than pure mystery, in my opinion. Though if this plot were adapted as a standalone film, I wonder if a more mysterious and streamlined plot would have been more of an advantage. But I'm not entirely sure. But I don't know. What do you think? So now it's time to talk about the themes. What was it all about? Or is it all big nothing? What makes me think I'm so special? Well, the first thing I noticed is how many confessions are in this episode. But before I review the confessions, let's ask a question. Why are these characters confessing? I think it's because they're all uniquely contradictory in their own way. At the end, when Tony looks at the Hawthorne quote about no one being able to be two people and not confuse themselves, most folks I know rightly assign this quote to Tony's state of mind. But it really applies to most of the characters in this episode. Fielder, the straight-laced honor student, despises her family's criminal activities, yet she turned to illegal street drugs when she found it necessary. Tony, the loving and jovial father with a Rolodex of dad jokes, is a sociopathic criminal murderer. Fabian, the flannel-wearing Mainer who's a volunteer fireman and travel agent by day, is a former big bad mafioso selling dime bags of junk. Carmela, the happy housewife who resents how whores could go to heaven before the righteous, since she's humiliated by her unfaithful husband's infidelity, yet she yearns to be forgiven for her own shameful sins. Father Phil, the Catholic priest sworn to celibacy, has romantic feelings for one of his own parishioners. And so I ask myself, what thematic structure can be applied here? Some characters volunteer confessions whereas others are compelled, and who they confess to varies between family and outsiders. Fielder volunteers her confession to her father about doing drugs. Tony tries to lie to his daughter about being in the mafia, but when it's clear she doesn't believe him, he then makes a reluctant admission. To me, it seems like he only tells her because it's obvious to him that lying will not work. A key detail here is that Tony doesn't clue in Fielder on the full extent of his crimes, and only admits that some of his income comes from illegal gambling and whatnot. Now, Carmela volunteers her confession to Father Phil. Although Father Phil has father in his name, he is not family to Carmela. One very important detail is the film Father Phil and her are watching. The Remains of the Day, a film released in 1993 starring Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson. In this film, spoiler alert, it came out like 30 years ago, Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson are servants in a very proper British household in the 1930s. And they both have unspoken feelings for each other, but they're forbidden from acting on them since it's considered inappropriate for servants within the same household to do that. It's British, so it's all very understated and they all look like they're struggling to hold in farts. And in this particular scene, Emma Thompson finds Anthony Hopkins reading a romance novel, but he doesn't tell her how he really feels. He chooses to not confess. This relates to both Carmela's choice to confess, since in the film, Anthony Hopkins' character regrets not confessing how he feels later in life. And presumably, Carmela confesses to Father Phil as opposed to saying nothing and regretting it later. On the other hand, the Hopkins character makes this choice based upon duty. And this relates to Father Phil's choice in this episode to remain steadfast to his duty as a priest. Fabian confesses to his mob ties to the government. It's frequently said that among the mobsters that they're forbidden from admitting that the mafia exists at all. Later in the series, a lot of the made guys are upset at Johnny Sack for admitting that the crime families exist at all. I think it's Phil, who may have done 20 years in the can. I don't know. He didn't say enough times that he did 20 years in the can, that's for sure. But if he did, he'd also said, you can't ever admit the existence of this thing. This is the primary difference between Tony and Fabian. They both confess that they're criminals, but Tony is only admitting it to his daughter. I'm not sure if that means he's breaking his oath, but Fabian definitely did. Now, other aspects are whether a character takes responsibility or blames circumstances beyond their control, and whether they change their behavior. Fielder admits to taking drugs and tells Tony she did so because she was overwhelmed with homework and other things, pretty much blaming her circumstances. but she also admits that it was too scary for her and she won't be doing it again. Tony blames his mob life on his upbringing. His father was in it, he barely got into college, and he didn't have any other options. He remains committed to the mob life and his oath to it. He does not change. Father Phil, like Tony, has a duty and code he must adhere to, though his commitment is to a holy order and not an unholy one. He struggles with romantic feelings, but ultimately he resists this temptation and he moves on from it. Carmela admits that she married Tony to enjoy the financial upside. Making a pact with evil has allowed her to live an easy life, though there's a heavy spiritual and mental price she's now paying for all of it. In spite of her grief, she still loves Tony. She doesn't cheat on him, and she doesn't leave him. There's a few other interesting parallels here. Nelvie and Carmela are both sick, and Fielder and Father Phil both get excessively drunk after hearing confessions. Another parallel, or perhaps a mirror image, is between Father Phil and Tony. The moment Father Phil walks through the door, he immediately confesses to Carmela that he has a Jones for her big Z. And at the end of the episode, Carmela confronts Tony about how he didn't tell her that his therapist is a woman. As Dr. Kakauer says much later in the series, that's probably the least of his misdeeds. In a meta sense, the Catholicism present in Italian-American communities is itself a contradiction within the mafia subculture that adheres to violent means and evil ends. Carmela and Father Phil seem to be the characters that represent this conflict more than the others. I know some folks have said that this episode has a theme of religion having inadequate answers, that the up and the cloud ideals presented lose their form once they reach the ground. But on the latest rewatch, I noticed how Father Phil discusses scripture with Carmela and says that faith is about loving and tolerating those that are different. And later, Fielder tells Carmela that she loves him, even though it's clear she knows he's lying to her. Father Phil and Carmela seem to be able to tolerate each other in the morning, in spite of their awkward non-affair. The only person absent of love, the only person who doesn't tolerate someone who's different, is Tony. Now, most Sopranos episodes have more plot threads than this episode, but it still strikes various thematic notes as characters make their confessions and reconcile themselves with their contradictions. Fielder's confession is partially to herself. She admits drugs are too scary and she won't do it again. Her choice is to never again take illegal drugs. Father Phil confesses to somebody else. He confesses his feelings to Carmela. His choice is to resist and not be led into temptation. Carmela confesses to God, but her choices might prevent her from being delivered from evil. Tony's confession is the most powerful. It's a confession to us, the audience, that we're watching a protagonist, but not a hero. Now it's time for pop culture. When Fielder asks Tony if he's in the mafia, Tony says, "It's a stereotype, and it's offensive, and you're the last person I would want to perpetuate it." Irina asks where is her knight in white satin armor. Tony tells Fielder that being a rebel and his family would be selling patio furniture on Route 22. Tony asks Carmela regarding the priest staying the night, "What'd you play? Name that pope?" Carmela says to Tony, "You are a sketch." She also refers to Janish as a sketch much later in the show. I had trouble finding a source for what calling someone a sketch means, but given the context, I think it's meant to mean that someone is sporadically funny, kind of like a sketch comedy, which is often short skits that are funny in unexpected ways. Tony Ray Rossi, who plays Fabian the Rat, was also in Analyze This. He starred alongside Tony Darrow, the actor who plays Larry Boyd Barisi. Paul Schultz, who plays Father Phil, was also in the film Zodiac, Panic Room, and a bunch of other films. He also played Ryan Chappelle in the TV show 24. In fact, he was in 24 episodes of 24, which is ironic, don't you think? Sarah Thompson, who plays one of the Colby students Fielder hangs out with, was also in The Ice Storm, a film from 1997. She was also in the films Taking Chance and the television show Angel. The student who tells Tony that Hawthorne is Bowden's most famous alumnus is actor Keith Nobbs, who later played Bud Conley in the HBO miniseries The Pacific. When Fielder mentions going to India for study abroad, Tony asks her what there is to learn in India, how to not get diarrhea, which is ironic given the food poisoning he experiences at the end of the next season after going to an Indian restaurant. Fielder also mentions suspecting her father was a mobster after finding $50,000 in cougar rants. Cougar rants are gold coins minted in South Africa, and in February of 1999, gold cost $287 per ounce. Today, it's over $4,600 per ounce. Doing the math, $50,000 of gold cougar rants in 1999 would be worth over $800,000 today. Marron. Fielder also mentions her generation liking Casino more than The Godfather. Casino is a 1995 film about organized crime in Las Vegas. It was directed by Martin Scorsese, who made a cameo on The Sopranos earlier this season. Tony mentions how Italian Americans didn't always have many opportunities, and Fielder mentions Mario Cuomo, who was governor of New York in the 1980s and early 1990s. The book Father Phil gives to Carmela is The Religions of Man, a book by Hudson Smith that was originally published in 1958. Melfi is wearing a college shirt for Bard College. It's revealed later in the series that her son goes to Bard. When Father Phil and Carmela are discussing William Dafoe playing Jesus in a film that almost cast Robert De Niro, they're referring to The Last Temptation of Christ, a film released in 1988. Fabian, or Fred, asks the mechanic about Tony, and he makes up a story about some guy from New York hitting his boat on Caribou Lake, which is in upstate Maine. I mean far upstate Maine. While we're talking about Maine, when Tony gives Christopher the number of the payphone to call, he gives a 207 area code, which is the single area code for all of Maine. Maine is one of the few states that still has one area code for the entire state. It's geographically large enough that Ginny Sack might not tip it over, but there aren't many people. When Tony finds Peter's trailer, he sees a bust of President Reagan. Reagan was president in 1987, which would have been 12 years ago, which would have been around the time that Fabian would be entering witness protection. When Tony tells Chris to not come to Maine, Chris says, "Ugats don't come." Ugats is derived from the Neapolitan phrase, "o caso," which literally translates to a part of male anatomy, but it has evolved to signify having absolutely nothing or something that is worthless. Carmela mentions AJ is sleeping over at the Peculios. The character Beppe Serbo is played by actor Joe Peculio. You might recognize him from the pilot episode. He's the guy who tells Tony that little puss will feel safe in Artie's restaurant. Carmela asks Father Phil, out of all the Fanuc priests, why did she end up with a straight one? Fanuc is Italian-American slang for a homosexual man, derived from the Italian word Fanuccio, which means fennel. Carmela also says, Madone, Father, please. Madonna is Italian-American slang derived from the Italian phrase Madonna Mia, which means Mother of God. Tony calls Fielder Miss Cuervo Anejo. Cuervo Anejo is a tequila brand. Fielder did mention she was doing shots of tequila earlier. When Tony starts questioning Carmela about Father Phil sleeping over, Carmela asks him if she looks like the Thornbird. This is a reference to an Australian novel called The Thornbirds, which was released in 1977 and turned into a miniseries in the early 1980s. The novel is about a mythical bird that sings only one compelling song during its life and then throws itself onto the thorns of a tree and dies. If I recall correctly, that novel also had a subplot about a priest almost kissing a young lady, which seems related to Father Phil and Carmela. Carmela is likely referring to the romantic close call with the priest as something she wouldn't seriously consider, and how she's not going to throw her life away for no reason like some bird brain. Highly allegorical, the sacred song and the propane priest. Also, when the priest builds a fire, Carmela remarks how those same logs have been in that fireplace since Lincoln split them. Much later in the series, Carmela makes Lincoln log sandwiches for AJ. Now for the whack count. There's one whack. This is Tony's first on-screen kill, and it's Fabian Petrulio, the rat. For the running total, there are 5 deaths. There's 3 whacks, one from the pilot, Email, one from Denial, Anger, Acceptance, Brendan, and one from college, which is Fabian. And there's 1 accidental death with the trucker from 46 Long, and 1 natural death, Jackie Sr. dying from cancer in Meadowlands. So now, it's time for some conclusions. First of all, we have to discuss Eddie freaking Falco. She knocked it out of the park this episode. Her performance here resulted in her first Primetime Emmy Award nomination and win for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Drama Series. Also, James Manos Jr. and David Chase won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Writing for a Drama Series for their work on this episode. This is also the first episode directed by Alan Coulter. He went on to direct 12 total episodes, nearly 14% of the entire series. This makes him the 3rd most prolific Sopranos director, second only to John Patterson and Tim Van Patten. When I first saw this episode in '99, I didn't fully understand the impact of a director, but after going to university and taking Professor Dupree's film arts class, I noticed a few things that Coulter's directing style brings to the show. The opening shot is a 360-degree shot of Tony, and there's also a 360-degree shot of both Carmela and Father Phil when he arrives at the Sopranos household. Coulter also employs the motif of faces being split into half light, half shadow, kind of like the Greek god Janus having 2 faces. This motif is even hinted at during the end of the prior episode, Meadowlands, when Tony mentions how the FBI is taking photographs of Uncle Junior's good side. Both the 360s and the split lighting are thematic tie-ins this episode by examining all the angles of a character. You find their contradictions. He also uses what's called a Dutch angle when Father Phil is stumbling to the powder room to orally refund wine, which reflects the character's state of mind as he's stumbling both physically and mentally. Also, when Tony comes to pick up Fielder after he kills the rat, their conversation is initially filmed through the car's windshield. This reminded me of something called mise-en-scène, something else I learned in film arts class. Separation in the frame can be symbolic of separation between characters. Tony is now lying to his daughter and outright gaslighting her. I wonder if this has anything to do with Plato's Cave in the Republic, where reflections symbolize a distorted illusion of reality, or is this a reference to the old biblical scripture of through a glass darkly? Or maybe I'm just seeing things that aren't there and I need to discontinue the lithium, I don't know. And there's some poetic tension when the scene cuts from Carmela confessing her fear of God's revenge to Fabian loading his gun outside the motel. Good editing, too. The strength of Coulter's style isn't just the techniques that he has, but that he uses them sparingly and at the right times for added effect. All good art has high notes, and a while back I was telling a writing friend of mine, Janine Eby, that her writing was like that. It had moments when storytelling techniques were used for extra effect in a way that strengthens the story. And I think that's also a good way to describe Coulter's directing style. Alan Coulter also directed a number of X-Files episodes, so you may recognize him if you're a fan. I don't know about y'all, but I love the X-Files. When people say that this episode changed television, they're not exaggerating, but I'm struggling to put it into words. One thing to consider is what television was like before and after this episode aired. Shows like The Wire, The Shield, Mad Men, Breaking Bad, and others that featured anti-heroes and came out after this indicate to me that this episode did have quite an effect, and it is a landmark in television storytelling. And it is a landmark episode in the history of television. According to some sources, HBO leaned on David Chase considerably, and they were very much opposed to having Tony murder a guy. Supposedly, the drug dealing angle was added as a compromise to make Fabian less sympathetic. But the real question is, who is Tony? The family man or the sociopath? Father Phil says that the whole world is God's house. He hears and sees everything, including Tony's countless crimes. When Tony sees Fabian, it's like a switch goes off with him. He deliberately puts his daughter in danger, he plays it off as just fooling around, but at times he seems to genuinely enjoy hunting the guy down and committing a premeditated murder. Not only does Tony kill the guy, but the murder is filmed like a horror movie from Fabian's, the victim's, perspective. Fabian even begs Tony, but Tony doesn't care. The shot of Tony looking up at the ducks after the murder is one of the most remarkable moments in Season 1, possibly the show. There was a new type of protagonist on television, and he was here to stay. And that's all I have for Episode 5 of Season 1, College. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe if you like this video. I'll be continuing my rewatch with Episode 6, and as soon as I have that, I'll upload it for y'all. Until then, have a good one. Video over!